The dark arts of writing are morally questionable techniques to use in your fiction.
And your new defense against the dark arts, teacher.
They're a bit suspect, they're a bit seedy, and they kind of manipulate the reader. I'm gonna give you 8 techniques, and though you might have some moral issues with a few of them, I guarantee you they're effective. 1. Counterphobia. A counterphobic writer looks for scenes that will shock and horrify the reader. This writer runs toward phobias rather than away from them, hence counterphobic. If you shock and horrify your audience, they won't be able to look away. Instinctually, humans are drawn toward the forbidden, the lurid. This is why people watch horror movies. But I will say that what used to be able to shock isn't able to shock anymore. If you look at older books like John Updike's novels or Philip Roth's novels, you'll find that the spicy scenes in there, they don't have the power to shock in a world which is post 50 Shades of Grey. But there are still things that can shock the reader, and I'll give you 3 examples. 1, any form of dehumanization. If you look at the French novel Camp of the Saints, it's probably the most offensive description of immigrants that I've ever seen in my life. It treats them as subhuman, and yes, as a reader, I was definitely shocked by that. 2, violence. Most of Cormac McCarthy's novels do include some sort of violent act, like in Blood Meridian, those dead babies hanging from a tree. And that sort of violence is very shocking to the reader, but also it's hard to look away and stop reading. 3, sexuality. Charlotte Roche published a book called Wetlands, which involves things that I probably can't mention on YouTube. Let's just say it is a frank and explicit description of her sexuality, and it was definitely a bestseller. Now, I'm not saying to use shock tactics in a gratuitous way. You definitely need these moments to serve the interests of the story. Really, your goal is to get a visceral reaction from the reader without turning them off so much that they abandon your book. The second dark art of writing is the Machiavellian character. Machiavellian just means someone who is cunning, who is able to manipulate others, and who is willing to do anything to get power. And honestly, these type of characters are difficult to write because it is so unlike all of our moral conditioning. Great example of this would be Frank Underwood from House of Cards. This is a man who staged a terror attack for political gain. He murders multiple people who could harm his political ambitions, and he even threw his favorite barbecue guy under the table in order to save his own skin. And that's not even mentioning things like strangling the dog or urinating on his father's grave. Now, obviously, this is a character who is manipulating others, but the dark arts part of this is how this manipulates the reader. It's part of the dark arts to make your Machiavellian character the protagonist rather than your antagonist. It would be so easy to cheer against Frank Underwood, but because we're seeing everything from his perspective, we're like, okay, like, I sort of get what you're doing. We sympathize with them when they're the main character. We almost admire them. It is such a powerful thing to make your reader like an unlikable character. When you make your reader love an evil character, you're basically tapping into their dark side. Things they wish they could do, but they don't because they're a good person. And they keep reading because they want to experience those evil desires vicariously. Another great example of this succeeding is Walter White. Even in season 3 and season 4, when it became very clear that he was the embodiment of an evil character, people were still cheering for him online. Like, they didn't get the change that had happened. He had broken bad. 3, gaslighting the reader. Gaslighting is just causing someone to question their sanity or their perception of reality. Now, there is an example of bad gaslighting, and this is where the reader says, like, am I stupid? Am I dumb? Am I just not getting this book? Like, for example, if in one chapter you have a character who's a blonde, and then the next chapter they're a brunette. That's just abusing the reader's trust. So it is very important when gaslighting the reader to make the reader feel tricked in an organic, holistic, oh, it makes sense now sort of way, rather than a rage-inducing, throw the book across the room sort of way. Great example of this is Eugene Bodelaskin's novel Laurus. So it's about this 15th century monk, and then all of a sudden in the novel there are plastic bottles in the 15th century. And I found myself saying, am I crazy? What is going on in this book? But then I kept reading and I figured out a large part of the message of this book is that time is an illusion and that all these events are happening simultaneously. Or take, for example, Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum. It's all about the occult and cults and secret societies and conspiracy theories. And you have all these characters who are creating fake conspiracy theories that end up becoming real. And so the reader doesn't know, like, wait, is this a fake conspiracy theory or is this like something that's actually true? Essentially, the dark art of gaslighting makes the reader question the reality of your novel. What is real and what is fake? Number 4, unsettling tactics. So Counterphobic, our first point, was all about these big shock and awe moments, while Unsettling Tactics is all about creating this low-grade uneasiness that just extends for long periods of the book. Unsettling Tactics is more about a mood you create that makes the reader uneasy.
And she's kind of matronly today.
And one way to do this is to stoke the anxiety of your reader. A great example of this is The Unconsoled by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a book that I did not enjoy reading. I don't think anyone did, because the entire book was like this dream anxiety, like missing a flight gaslight or showing up for a speech without having prepared for it or being naked in a public place. And so the whole time while reading this novel, you're just vaguely uneasy. Another unsettling tactic is to stoke dread. Brian Evanson does this really well in his novels, but I'll just highlight one example from Fugue State. Part of the story is where a parent leaves and says, listen, when a timer goes off, someone's gonna knock at the door. Whatever you do, don't open the door. So this kid's home alone, timer goes off, someone starts knocking at the front door. Keeps knocking, keeps knocking, keeps knocking for a really long time. And the whole time the reader's like, what is going to happen? Are they gonna break down the door? Like, what is going on? I mean, it's really difficult to read, but at the same time, you can't stop reading. His work is disquieting. It's like listening to a dissonant chord that never resolves. But really, the difficulty in using this technique is to maintain that uneasiness over a long period of time and never let the reader feel, oh, like the tension has gone out of your story. But think of a book that made you uneasy page after page after page, and yet you couldn't stop reading it. It's a dark arts technique that a lot of readers crave. 5, emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail is when you really don't want something to happen in a novel, but the author just hangs it over your head, like threatening it at every single moment. A little bit like Damocles' sword, if you remember, it was hanging by a thread over some poor guy's head, and he's like, oh, at any moment it could fall, and he's just nervous the whole time. What's key about this dark art is not resolving the tension. If you resolve it either way, then it's no longer emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail is about keeping the reader in discomfort for as long as possible, not allowing them to know what's going to happen. Say there's a character that your reader loves, right? And so you have them disappear and it's unclear whether they've been killed or not, and you don't answer whether they've been killed or not. Perhaps not until the next book, but ideally not until the end of the novel. You give them little hints that this character has died, but you don't actually like say outright like, oh, here's their dead body. So basically the blackmail is if you stop reading, you're not gonna find out whether this character died or is still alive. It's very much a Schrodinger's cat moment. This is the reason why so many readers feel cheated by the end of a book which is ambiguous or doesn't answer the central plot question, because the blackmail doesn't end even at the end of the book. 99% of the time you want to stop emotional blackmail of the reader by the end. Okay, we have 3 dark arts left and they are some of the best ones. Number 6, red herrings. Red herring is just a logical fallacy where, say, someone's making an argument and you just change the topic to something else. You just lead them on a completely different trail. And that's because you can't win the argument, so you're like, I'm gonna change the rules of this conversation and just talk about something else. But what we're talking about in storytelling is not changing the topic as much as diversion. It's like a magician who is, doing something over here so you can't see that his right hand is doing the trick over here. And here's an example from Harry Potter. Everyone thinks Snape is the one sabotaging Harry's broom during the Quidditch match because, he's doing his little incantations and stuff. And they also think he was letting the trolls loose in the dungeon. But by the end of the book, surprise, you learn that someone else was doing all of that and Snape was the red herring. And obviously Rowling put that in to trick the reader. It was a deliberate misdirection because the reader would feel more pleasure when they found out who the actual guilty party was. Another example from Harry Potter, Prisoner of Azkaban. Rowling makes you think that Sirius is a menace and dangerous to Potter, and it's not until later that we realize, oh, this guy's actually on Harry Potter's side. Now, what happens if you don't use the dark art of red herrings? Well, then your reader isn't surprised. They reach the end of your book and they're like, oh, well, that's kind of what I thought all along. I thought that was the murder. I thought that was going to happen. So the dark art of red herrings is all about actively trying to mislead your reader. And you might say, oh, I don't want to do that to my reader, but guess what? They will enjoy your book more if you do it. Number 7, emotional trigger points. Do you remember Spock's Vulcan death grip? He just pinch this person's neck and they'd go into a faint. One of the dark arts is learning how to use emotional trigger points on your readers. Hopefully your reader doesn't faint and collapse, but you do want to get this emotional response from them. Like ASMR, where certain sounds make people's skin feel tingly and get goosebumps. Emotional trigger points create this emotional reaction in the reader, which is very primitive and instinctual and uncontrollable. They're appealing to this genetic code within us, our emotional hardwiring. A great place to learn how to do emotional trigger points is soap operas. They really focus on the parts of a person's life which create these strong emotional reactions. Birth, abortion, pregnancy, birthdays, weddings, proposals, kidnapping, amnesia, love triangles, impersonation, infidelity, blackmail. So does using a whole bunch of these constitute manipulation of the reader? Well, that's kind of what makes it into part of the dark arts. What surprises me is how many writers don't tap into one of these emotional trigger points. I'll read 50 pages in a book and there's nothing that really moves me. There's nothing going on. There's not an event where I'm like, oh, that just broke my heart. So I would recommend watching 10 minutes of a soap opera and write down 1 or 2 of the emotional trigger points that you could use in your own book. The danger really is overuse, right? You don't want to jam pack your entire story with dozens of these because then it will seem melodramatic. Use them sparingly and these emotional trigger points will work on your reader and get them involved in your story. 8, an unreliable narrator. Let me pose a question. Is every narrator unreliable? Well, not omniscient narrators, obviously, but first-person narrators or limited third narrators, they are always skewing the truth even just a tiny bit. And then we have some extreme examples where they're obviously deceiving the reader. Think of Humbert in Lolita, who is convinced that a 12-year-old girl can actually be in love with him. Or think of Fight Club, where you have the narrator who is so supremely unreliable that in the end you realize he's been misrepresenting one of the 2 main characters. An unreliable narrator is part of the dark arts of writing because it makes the reader question their reality. When we learn in Atonement that Brioni has created this fiction about a significant portion of the novel, we have to look back and read the whole book in a completely different light. And I have 2 pieces of advice if you want to use this dark art. 1, choose whether the reader's going to be able to sense that this is an unreliable narrator or whether they're going to be blindsided at the end of the book. Like in Lolita, all the readers realize, oh, this man is clearly fooling himself. There's no way this girl's in love with this man. While novels like Fight Club and Atonement are much more about the shock of reveal at the end of the book. And then lastly, don't make the reader feel cheated. You need to earn your unreliable narrator. There needs to be a reason why that character lied to the reader or misrepresented events. There needs to be motivation. Use these dark arts sparingly, use them carefully, and if anyone asks, you didn't get them from me.